Senator Markey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. Mr. Ross, we're in the world of the Internet of Things, as the Internet is built into the appliances which we use, the machines which we use, the automobiles, the SUVs. Everything now is part of the world of the Internet of Things. But, you know, IoT isn't just going to stand for Internet of Things. It's also going to stand for the Internet of Threats to the security, to the privacy of all Americans, as this technology is built into every device. So as we move forward, we have to think at the same time about cybersecurity, about privacy, about what are the protections which we're going to give to Americans so that their privacy and security is not constantly subject to compromise. Could you tell the committee what your views are on that issue and what you would recommend that we do in order to protect Americans?
Well, I've had some direct experience with it. As you know, we've invested in a number of small and medium-sized banks around the country, and even they are subject to cyber attacks from all over the place. Some are just from hackers who simply seem to want to prove that they can do it, but others are evil ones trying to steal people's identities, trying to steal people's money, all kinds of things. So it certainly is a serious problem, and it's the unfortunate flip side of interconnectedness, is how do you balance interconnectedness and two-way communication and two-way or multiple-way everything with protecting people. I think we need to be extremely vigilant and keep developing new and better systems, because the people who have bad intent are certainly trying to develop new and better ways to break in. So it's a continuing challenge.
I've introduced legislation which is essentially a cyber labeling program that would just say to industries of the United States, you have to label devices in terms of how secure they are from being hacked, from having privacy compromised. What do you think about that idea? And don't you think on a voluntary basis that is something that we could ask for American industry now to adopt as a practice?
Well, I'm quite sure that American industry is becoming more and more sensitized to the problem. There's no company I know of any size whatsoever that hasn't been having these threats, ranging from electric utilities to every other kind of endeavor. So I think everybody appreciates the problem. Exactly what's the solution and whether one size fits all, I think, is a more complicated issue and one that needs a lot of very thorough investigation. But
and I appreciate that. You know, the one problem, of course, is that there are many companies that are never going to invest in cyber security protections, and that is where the problem is going to be created, where the vulnerability is going to be created. So I'm looking forward to working with you on that. Senator Fisher and I have introduced the Federal Spectrum Incentive Act, which offered new incentives for federal agencies to relinquish underutilized spectrum. I know that Senator Cruz just asked about whether we should incentivize federal agencies to vacate or share spectrum they don't need. Will you commit to working with Senator Fisher and I so that we can try to find a way of moving forward legislation that does create those incentives for the federal agencies to free up the spectrum that the private sector could use?
Right. Well, I think it probably would need to be a legislative solution, because it's fairly clear to me that Commerce does not have the power to do it on its own. So to the degree that there's going to be an incentive given, I think it would absolutely have to be legislated.
So, and New Bedford, Massachusetts is the highest grossing fishing port in the United States. What actions would you support to ensure that seafood brought to the market is legally caught and sustainable?
Oh, I think that's very, very important. For one thing, in terms of the domestic catch, clearly the objective should be the maximum sustainable yield. So that as a starting principle, but also a lot of the imports that come in are produced under conditions that would not be tolerable in the United States. And I think that needs to be dealt with. It needs to be dealt with also at the port level. My understanding is that if a shipment of food comes in that for whatever reason is rejected at a given port, all that happens is then that vessel diverts to another port and hopes to get the same food in. Well, since only 2% of the cargoes are ever inspected, that means they got a 98% chance to get away with it the second time. And meanwhile, the food is a couple of days older and perhaps a couple of days worse conditions. So I think we need to deal with it at a whole series of levels.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Markey.